Okay, our next speaker, David Sweanor, who's an adjunct professor at the Faculty of Law, University of Ottawa. Thanks, David.
Thanks very much. As a lawyer, issues of disclosure and informed consent are really important. So I should say I don't actually personally get any money from anybody in any part of this issue, whether it's people selling products, people opposing the products. I do, though, personally fund some people who are involved on issues of harm reduction, which may itself be a significant conflict. Also, PowerPoint presentations in my attention span don't work really well together. So you should know that as we're starting out here. Those of you who understand the science of nicotine would probably suggest that it would be a good idea if I use some, and by the end of this presentation, you might have a better idea of that. But I was asked to talk a bit about the evidence in this area and some of the legal and ethical questions that come up. And anybody who's been involved, anybody who's following this, knows that this has become one of the issues that we would identify with a culture war. So by comparison, if we wanted to discuss global warming here in the UK, you can usually have a pretty rational discussion based on evidence. If you want to discuss it in Texas, you get a culture war. If you want to discuss gun control here compared to Texas, if you want to discuss birth control here compared to Texas, and I don't want to knock down Texas because I'm a Canadian and generally I want to say bad things about the states in general, but it's an interesting question as to how did we get into this sort of situation? What does it mean? And how might we be able to deal with it? Because trying to move into the actual evidence, there's a lot of really, really interesting questions. You know, just sitting here listening to Robert and Linda and thinking that, you know, when we're looking at who's using e-cigarettes and we're assuming that they're also using nicotine, I was recently talking to a merchant bank in California that's really interested in this market. And one of the reasons they're interested is they're finding quite a few people who are using electronic cigarettes aren't using nicotine, and they aren't smokers. At which point I sort of freak out. And they say, no, what they're doing is you've got people who are using it instead of having dessert. So that they just want something that gives them a flavor. They're using it as a way of reducing their caloric intake. That's really significant. I'd like to know, you know, how many of the people who are non-smokers who are saying they're using electronic cigarettes are using it for things like that. Those are just evidentiary questions that are really important as we try to develop policy. So, but how do you get there when we're in the sort of battle that we see with global warming in Texas, where people are simply fighting you, they don't accept the evidence. You've got people who have taken a position, and they're looking at the evidence only insofar as that will support the position they've got. And we like to think that science doesn't work that way, that we're supposed to be dispassionate, we look at the evidence, we make rational decisions based on the evidence, and in areas like public health, we do great things for people's health. In reality, science tends not to work that way. We end up with a lot of significant problems simply because of all the culture wars that come out on issues of science historically, and we see it on a great many issues. This raises all sorts of really interesting questions in terms of the ethics. What's our obligation to consumers? What should we be telling people? How soon should we be telling them? What are the legal consequences if we don't tell them? Some of the stuff is pretty straightforward, I think, from an ethical standpoint in terms of what should we be saying to people? What should we be telling consumers about the evidence that we've got? Some, you know, pretty basic things of, don't we have an obligation to tell them the truth? If we've got information, you know, are we sharing it? Is it acceptable to engage in what's called the noble lie, that to tell people something that's not truthful, but we think it's for their own good? So if we scare people into believing any form of nicotine is really, really hazardous, do we get more people to quit? And ethicists who have looked at this, people like Bach, have just demolished the argument. We don't have an ethical basis for telling people that things that are not true. But for many people, you know, where we might see them as engaging in deception and unethical behaviors, we have the reality that they don't see the world that way. And there's good explanations as to why we get into a lot of these fights. And we've had them on so many issues. It's actually quite exceptional in science to get to an area where you don't have these sorts of issues. the sort of stuff that Thomas Kuhn has written about in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, that you do have vested interest in any issue. And if you are an expert in a particular area of physics, and you've got tenure as a result of that, and you're traveling around the world to lots of conferences, and you're seen as one of the gods of the field, and somebody comes along, say Einstein, and he completely disrupts this with a totally out-of-the-box, innovative idea, you're threatened. And what are you going to do about it? And as Bohr has said, science advances one funeral at a time. Or, you know, ideas don't change. It's just the people who have them eventually die. And the hope is that with some rational thinking, with a different approach to this, we can speed that process up. So you don't have to wait for so many people to die, because, among other things, life expectancy among scientists is quite high now. This brings in other issues, though, that go beyond the stuff that Kuhn was writing about, because he was writing 60 years ago, and the new field of moral psychology, that we all have different underpinnings in terms of how we see the world, the moral frameworks that we use. And there's some very good stuff that's been coming out recently on trying to understand why people disagree on things. And often that can be explained because they simply have a different moral framework. And the sort of stuff that Jonathan Haidt has written about there's different ways that we see the world. And Lynn Kozlowski and others had an excellent article a few years ago looking at the debate about harm reduction and smokeless tobacco. And why is it people are talking past each other? And it's explained by moral psychology, that if you have somebody who sees the world in terms of issues like fairness and autonomy, what you do when you're interacting with other people about the use of something like nicotine is very different than if you have a view that is based on a hierarchical power structure, loyalty to an in-group, deferring to authorities, or if you have a view that's based on a pureness or sanctity. And they see the issue differently, their reaction is very different, and they simply can't understand why other people take a different view. You know, we need to understand that sort of thing, where they're saying that much of the way our species thinks, I mean, as much as we like to think that we're rational, it's intuitive. It's based on these moral frameworks. And then we use our rationality to try to justify the position we've already taken. So it is very much feeding into this culture war idea that you've already got this position. Now you're looking for the evidence to back it up, rather than you're trying to examine the evidence to figure out what sort of position you should have. So, and then adding on to that, beyond issues of the general battles in science and issues of moral psychology, is the ideology people bring to bear. So if someone has an ideology, political, economic view of the world, a philosophical view, it's going to shape the way that they see these things. You know, are you anti-market? Are you anti-industry? Are you pro-market? You know, how do you feel about bad guys? Who do you identify as a bad guy? And if you have a fairly common view within the anti-smoking community, which is anything that tobacco companies do you want to oppose, well, that's already dictated the way you're going to act. I mean, it's fairly simplistic. It's really a cartoonish caricature of the industry, but it can dictate what people are going to do. But also the way that Ron Borland from Australia has described this, if we look at many of our colleagues, the position they take is going to be based on the sort of background that they have. What sort of academic training did they do? What are their experiences in life? Many people doing tobacco control come from sort of a sociology, legal sort of background. We tend to see the world in terms of social determinants. If something is happening, there's some sort of social reason why. Like there's a big bad company that has caused this to happen, and what you need to do is you just deal with that company and the problem goes away. And many of us were surprised when we started paying attention to things like biology, pharmacology, neuroscience, understanding the reasons why people would be using things like nicotine. Those who come from a biological sort of background aren't surprised by this at all. I mean, they're often surprised, you know, why are we doing things that are not very effective in terms of policy interventions? Well, it's based on the sort of ideology that we have from where we've come from. But given that that's the sort of problem that we're in and how I think we've got into a culture war, there's still these responsibilities that if we're a true profession, we have to figure out what are we going to do about them. And certainly the idea of giving information to consumers is incredibly important. And as people like James Patterson, a historian of public health, has written, if we look at the history of public health, many of our biggest breakthroughs are a result of two really, really simple things. One, you give people enough information to make an informed decision. And two, you give them the ability to act on that information. You do that, and great things happen. And yet, we're in a situation where often people don't have that sort of information. And I think it picks up on the things we were just hearing about, why would there be a leveling off of the rate of increase in use of things like electronic cigarettes? Could part of that be explained by a lack of information? And there was a wonderful book written on this topic around 1970 by Robert Sweanor called Don't Blame the People. And his general thesis is that we have this tendency to say, well, people don't deserve any better. If they're making bad decisions, it's their own fault. And making the point that people can only make as good a decision as the information available to them allows. If we deprive people of sufficient information to make an informed decision, we can't ethically then hold them personally responsible for having made a bad decision. So we have obligations in that area, and we have consequences from that. If you don't meet an acceptable standard, if we're not doing what ethically we should in terms of informing consumers, of passing along the evidence, of getting the best evidence, seeking evidence to try to find the truth rather than to back up a pre-existing condition, pre-existing view, there are all sorts of problems that flow from it, whether it be legal in being sued, regulatory in terms of the problems that we run into trying to enforce laws, but also reputational. And reputation is incredibly important in public health because we have persuasive power far more than we have coercive power. We get somewhere by being able to tell people, here's what you should do, and I'm a credible person, and you should believe me, as opposed to, I can make you do this. And when we do things that hurt our credibility, when we're giving out inaccurate information, when we do something where it looks like we really aren't taking care of the public, and tainted blood scandals are a really good example of that from the recent past, we destroy a lot of our credibility. We lose that persuasive power, and we lose it not just on the issue that's at hand, but if you do something that hurts your credibility in one issue, you've hurt your credibility on lots of others. And we also have to look at what point do we speak out? At what point do we have an ethical obligation to talk to consumers about what we know? And there is this view that I think ties into the culture wars and very similar to what we used to hear in the culture wars on cigarette smoking. Well, we don't know enough yet. We need longitudinal studies. We need to do more research. This might be wrong. We're not really certain. Well, when you've got a differential in risk that's absolutely enormous based on everything that we can see, and where our degree of certainty about that differential is really high, at what point is there enough information in order to justify telling consumers about it? And at what point is there enough information you simply can't ethically justify not telling people about it? And so that's largely the mess we're in. I think the idea of how do we get out of it, as I was saying, this is not exceptional. I mean, most areas in science, most areas in terms of any paradigm shift, in Kuhn's words, create incredible animosity, great fights. And we often lose sight of that many of the things we now accept were battled out. They were culture wars. There was a lot of opposition, whether it be things like vaccinations interfering with the will of God, manufactured foodstuffs in the 1800s in the United States were vigorously opposed by the pure food movement. It was a horrible thing. It was going to cause urbanization. Urbanization was going to cause sin. Bicycles in the 1890s were seen as a huge affront to basic morality. And in ways that, I mean, most of us would have real trouble trying to think of what that problem was. But there were some very strong feelings about it. I mean, among other things, what if a young couple were courting and they were riding bicycles, they could get out of sight of their chaperone. And imagine what would happen to their reputation and the reputations of their families. I mean, you can't allow things like this. We've got to get rid of bicycles. I mean, electricity was seen as a big problem. Women participating in sport was a significant problem here in Europe in the 1930s. And yet, for many of these issues, I mean, we transition. We get beyond them to the point that we don't think they're a big deal. Sometimes they change very quickly, and you know, is a more optimistic view than saying we just have to wait for funerals. If we look at how societal views have changed in most of our countries on things like gay marriage, common law relationships, interracial dating, that phenomenal change in very, very short periods of time. So we've seen these changes happen. And we've seen how, and again, global warming is a good example, how something that could be a scientific discussion in one country and be a culture war in another country. Well, what can we learn in terms of why these things happen the way that they do? And how to, when we're looking at things like the role that regulation can play in helping to do this, to give the issue to some authority that's going to take care of it. And I think that played a huge role in dealing with things like food regulation, alcohol regulation, pharmaceutical regulation, medical devices. But we have the unintended consequence that flows from giving control of this to people who worry a whole lot about unintended consequences. Because if we set the bar too high, in terms of what level of evidence are you going to need, then a lot of things can't get over that bar. And a really good example right now is in the United States with their FDA law. They do have a system in place that allows you to get a less hazardous product on the market in order to replace cigarettes. It's been in place for, what, 5.5 years. Not a single product has so far been able to make that standard. What's that do? Well, it creates serious problems. I mean, among other things, they're coming to the realization that the level of evidence you need to convince legislators to pass a law is very different from the level of evidence you need to enforce the law when you start dealing with constitutional challenges, evidentiary burden under administrative law, et cetera. And if you don't set up your regulations correctly, what you end up with is that the fear that you have of something going wrong actually protects the status quo, which is the biggest problem we've got. And that ties back into the sorts of problems we'd have with tort law. For people who aren't giving accurate information, who aren't protecting the public, are they likely to be sued? And is that going to affect not just the government agencies, that, depending on what jurisdiction they're in, there's likelihoods of success in suing them, but there's also the reputational risk. I mean, being sued because you've done something that's caused the deaths of lots of people, as tobacco companies can attest, doesn't do very much for your reputation, regardless of whether you win that litigation. And again, we have persuasive power, not coercive power. If litigation ends up harming the standing of the overall public health community, we're in serious trouble. So in terms of trying to move it forward, I think that there's great stuff by Dan Kahan from Yale recently on looking at how do you deal with a culture war. And one of the possibilities is you find like a higher order purpose. You find an issue that more people can agree on to bring them together to say that there's something that they want to do, and that what sort of evidence can you get that does that? Are there things that we can get the answers that shuts up a lot of the people who simply want to oppose anything from happening? Climate change being another really good example. And science can do that. And I think when we look at what sort of evidence we need to accumulate, to look at things that gets rid of some of the opposition, that allows us to think more broadly, that not that is there an issue here, but how are we going to deal with it? And I think we can learn from the other issues that we've dealt with. What are the issues that have gone from being culture war issues to being acceptable areas of science, public policy? How do we get there? And so learn from that. We have a possibility of doing something very significant if we can get it right. And rather than being involved in pretending we're living in Texas, we can actually do something that is going to be really, really significant for public health. Thank you.
Thanks very much, David. That is the first time I think I've seen you give a PowerPoint presentation. And you did it very well too.